Today we're resuming our study in Matthew after having taken a break for some time to talk about other things. And I'm resuming within what I have called section 6 of Matthew's Gospel, which I have titled, Jesus Pronounces Judgment Against Israel and Its Leaders. And that portion goes basically from the end of chapter 20. You see the story of the healing of the two blind men near Jericho. And then section 6 just keeps going through to the end of chapter 25. So that is section 6 as I have outlined it. And we just finished a portion of that section that I titled, The Leaders of the Kingdom Lose the Kingdom. So that was mainly the leaders there in Jerusalem come to Jesus, ask him by what authority he does these things, and it all ends up with him telling those three parables against them. And that was the portion that I titled, The Leaders of the Kingdom Lose the Kingdom. So we just finished that portion of section 6. So today we are beginning the study of a new portion. This is actually the third portion of section 6. So within section 6, we're in portion 3. If you can keep my outlining in your mind, that's the way I would define it for you. And as you know, I've been in the habit of giving each of these portions its own summary, and these summaries are also titles, and the titles are meant to summarize for you what is actually going on in this portion. Now, the sermon for today is meant not only to introduce you to the third portion, but also to show you why I summarize it the way I do. So that is going to give you the agenda for today as I tell you what I've titled this third portion. And my title is this: The Insightful King Silences the Fools. The king being Jesus and the fools being all the leaders there in Jerusalem. And Jesus is going to have a very long conversation with several of them. And we're going to read this portion right now. And you'll see why I title it the way I do, I think for the most part, just in reading it through. So let's go ahead and read this third portion. Matthew 22, verses 15 through 46 is where we are. So Matthew 22, starting in verse 15, and really it goes to the end of the chapter. So this is after Jesus concludes his third parable against the leaders of Jerusalem, right there. It says, Then the Pharisees went and plotted together how they might trap him in what he said. And they sent their disciples to him, along with the Herodians, saying, Teacher, we know that you are truthful and teach the way of God in truth, and defer to no one, for you are not partial to any. Tell us then, what do you think? Is it lawful to give a poll tax to Caesar or not? But Jesus perceived their malice and said, Why are you testing me, you hypocrites? Show me the coin used for the poll tax. And they brought him a denarius. And he said to them, Whose likeness and inscription is this? They said to him, Caesar's. Then he said to them, Then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And hearing this, they were amazed, and leaving him, they went away. On that same day, some Sadducees, who say there is no resurrection, came to Jesus and questioned him, asking, Teacher, Moses said, if a man dies having no children, his brother, as next of kin, shall marry his wife and raise up children for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers with us, and the first married and died, and having no children, left his wife to his brother. And also the second and the third, down to the 7th. Last of all, the woman died. In the resurrection, therefore, whose wife of the 7 will she be? For they all had married her. But Jesus answered and said to them, You are mistaken, not understanding the Scriptures nor the power of God. For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. But regarding the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what was spoken to you by God? I am the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. When the crowds heard this, they were astonished at his teaching. But when the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered themselves together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question, testing him. Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? And he said to him, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend the whole law and the prophets. Now, while the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them a question. What do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he? They said to him, The son of David. He said to them, Then how does David in the Spirit call him Lord, saying, The Lord says to my Lord, Sit at my right hand until I put your enemies beneath your feet. If David then calls him Lord, how is he his son? No one was able to answer him a word, nor did anyone dare from that day on to ask him another question. Now, today I hope to introduce to you this third portion. Just as I said, this is going to be an introductory message, not getting into any details, but trying to do an overview. My outline for today has 5 headings, and I'll give you those 5 headings right now to let you know what I'll be trying to do today. First, I just want to say that these events happen on the temple grounds in the presence of the crowds with representatives from several groups in Jerusalem. So this first heading is just dedicated to setting and the cast of characters, so to speak. Secondly, the questions presented to Jesus together show the fullness of the wisdom of Jesus. So in the plan of God, and also in just as Matthew records these things, the point here is to show you the fullness of the wisdom of Jesus as he answers these men and talks to them. My third heading is that Christ shows the fullness of his wisdom to support his recent accusations. This is referring back to the prior portion where he was basically describing the leaders of the kingdom losing the kingdom and why that was going to happen. A very accusatory portion in which he identifies a great many of their sins. And I think that this portion that we're studying now is meant to support all of that. So Jesus shows the fullness of his wisdom to support his recent accusations. Fourthly, the answers of Jesus enlarge the mind, and there's no way to really explain that except to get into the details of it, so we'll get there, what I mean by enlarging the mind. And then finally, my fifth heading, Jesus ends this debate with the divine kingship of the Messiah. So this is when he turns and asks them a question, and the purpose of that question is to bring back to their minds the divine kingship of the Messiah. Now, as I've often done, I will present these Jerusalem authorities as bad examples. There's not really much else to do with them. These are men who are sort of the ultimate bad examples that we encounter in the ministry of Christ. So there's nothing really more for us to do than to identify them as such and try to learn from their bad example. And as I progress through this portion in my next several sermons, my focus is going to fall more upon the glory of Christ as a wise king able to dispel falsehood and humble fools. So, and of course that is certainly meant to be the main idea of all of this, and that's what I'll be trying to do as we get into the portion. But for today, I want to direct your attention to the fools themselves, these men who are coming against Jesus, trying to entrap him and humiliate him and otherwise perplex him and test him with all their questions. And I want to direct your attention to those fools in the hopes that you will then desire to conduct yourself more wisely than they did. Try to learn from them, try to go the opposite direction as they were going, as they were dealing with Christ. These are men whom Jesus dismisses from his kingdom, right? That was really what we saw in the prior portion, talking about how these men, although they are the leaders of the kingdom of God, they are all being dismissed and demoted and cast out, and they face judgment rather than the prestige they by rights should have had. And all of that is happening because of their wickedness and because of their own way of dealing with Christ. Now, for those of us who hope to enter that kingdom and who hope to be a part of that kingdom and be the king's people, it is absolutely necessary not to make the same mistakes as these men have made. We want to make sure that our own conduct and our own ways of dealing with Christ are the exact opposite of how these men dealt with him. So to that end, we're going to go through this summary of this portion today, and hopefully you'll see a little bit more of how these men have gone wrong, and you'll see a bad example not to follow in your own life. So let's begin with my first heading. Just to give you the scene at work here in this portion, these events happen on the temple grounds in the presence of the crowds with representatives from the several groups there in Jerusalem. So, in case you forgot, and you may have forgotten just because we haven't mentioned this for a while, Jesus and these leaders are having these controversies on the temple grounds. That is, they are on the property there where the temple is. Now, I want to go back here to chapter 21, actually, in verse 23, and just read to you where we see that. So chapter 21, verse 23, where it says this, "So when Jesus entered the temple, the chief priests and the elders of the people came to him while he was teaching and said, 'By what authority are you doing these things, and who gave you this authority?'" So you see there, it was as Jesus entered the temple that this whole conversation begins. Now, since that time, we have seen Jesus answer their question there, and then tell his three parables, and now we see him begin to field these three questions that these men have to ask him. So a lot of material has passed since that note about him entering the temple, but the scene has not changed. We have not been told at all by Matthew that Jesus got up and went somewhere else. In fact, we're not going to see that until much later, actually at the very beginning of chapter 24 of Matthew. So for all this time, we're still there, sort of on the temple grounds. The building is right there, and the altar and all these things and all that. The courtyard probably is where we are, the courtyard of the temple. That is where we are at this moment. I just want you to have that in view as you imagine these things in your mind. Furthermore, you should remember that Jesus and these leaders are at all times surrounded by the crowds. So these are not private debates and not private words of Jesus to them. The crowds are always surrounding them. Going back again to verse 23 of chapter 21, which I just read, it says, "When he entered the temple, the chief priests and the elders of the people came to him while he was teaching and said, 'By what authority are you doing these things, and who gave you this authority?'" So not only is the temple, of course, a public place, he is actually teaching. There's a group of people there who are listening to his teaching when all this begins. There must have been a crowd present, and that crowd remains present through the three parables that we've already studied. Just to show you that, go on to verse 46. Here, after the second parable, it says, "When they sought to seize him," so the leaders getting angry at Jesus for these parables he's telling, "when they sought to seize him, they feared the people because they considered him to be a prophet." So all the people are still around there and very actively engaged in what's going on. I mean, they're rowdy. They're a rowdy bunch, all right there listening to these parables. So they're still there through all of that. And the crowd actually remains present during these questions that we're going to be studying in my next several sermons. And we know that when we get into chapter 22, verse 33, after Jesus answers the Sadducees, it says, "When the crowds heard this, they were astonished at his teaching." So the crowds are still there listening to all these questions being posed to Jesus and his answers to them. And then finally, after the questions, after the last question has been asked, the crowds are still very much there. You go there, and it's actually the question that Jesus asks to the Pharisees, and he gives them his own answer to his own question. And then you get into chapter 23, verse 1, and it says, "Then Jesus spoke to the crowds and to his disciples." So after all the questions are done, he stops dealing with those leaders and turns to the crowds who are still there. So through all this time, as you imagine this showdown between Jesus and the leaders of Jerusalem, just imagine those crowds always being present. Imagine this as a public matter happening in a public place. As the leaders try to humiliate Jesus, they also take the risk of being humiliated, which is exactly what happens as things go on. So here they are trying to shame Jesus before the crowds, and they end up walking out of there with shame on their own heads because of how Jesus answers them. So that is the dynamic here at work, all these crowds listening in to these conversations between Jesus and the Jerusalem authorities. Now, as for who gets humiliated here, let's discuss the fools themselves and just who they are, what we know about them from what we see here. First, we have a group that we actually have not seen in Matthew's gospel. So we have a brand new group of people coming to enter the fight against Jesus, and these are the Herodians. They are there with the disciples of the Pharisees in the first question. And as their name implies, these men are simply the supporters of the Herod family. So you might remember Herod the Great, who was king of Israel when Jesus was born. He was king under the Romans, so he's not an independent king. He's what's known as a client king there. But then he had a whole bunch of sons and relatives. The kingdom was parceled up between them after he died. And there was all a bunch of political stuff that we don't want to get into now. But there is this family that, a very dynastic family, a kingly family there in Israel, the Herod family. And the Herodians are their supporters. They want to see the Herod family have as much power as possible there in Israel. They are content with Roman rule. They like the Romans. These are usually very wealthy men who are very much profiting from the state of affairs there. But when it comes to who rules Israel underneath the Romans, they want the Herod family to be in charge. They're very much supporters of the Herod family. So that's who they are. Now, next to the Herodians, we actually have their polar opposites, the Pharisees. This is a group we've encountered before, and they show up as well, or the disciples of the Pharisees show up there in that first question. Now, whereas the Herodians are primarily a political group, the Pharisees are primarily religious. So in that sense, they're polar opposites, whereas the Herodians are a political party. The Pharisees are more of a religious kind of person. And the Pharisees are the most diligent observers of the traditional interpretations and applications of the law of Moses, which is just to say you have the scribes there in Israel, the rabbis, teaching not just the law of Moses, but their own interpretations and applications of the law. And the Pharisees are the most devoted supporters and followers of those teachings. So you might put it this way, it's not merely what Moses wrote, but what the scribes thought Moses should have written also. As they get into their teachings of the law of Moses, they are very much adding to things, but adding according to what they think is right in their own eyes. And the Pharisees are following all of that. So a very religious group here, the Pharisees, the most ardent followers of the law and the traditional interpretations of the law as given by the scribes. Now, although the Pharisees are primarily religious, their religious beliefs lead them to be pretty much anti-Rome. They don't really like Roman authority. They wish the Romans were just gone, allowing them to conduct themselves according to their religion, according to their law in peace. So very much opposite the Herodians. Very interesting that they show up together there in that first question, and we'll be talking about that when the time comes. So okay, we got the Herodians, we got the Pharisees, we have another group here, the Sadducees. Okay, so the Sadducees, like the Herodians, if you're wondering who these people are, the Sadducees, like the Herodians, they favored Roman rule of Israel. They're very much at peace with the Romans. The Sadducees are usually of a wealthier sort, so they're benefiting from the status quo. But instead of wanting the Herod family to rule Israel, they actually want the high priest to rule Israel. So if you're wondering what the Sadducees actually are, you can think of them as the political party for the high priest. They are the supporters of the high priest, and they basically want the high priest to have as much authority as possible in Israel under Rome. So that is the basic gist of who the Sadducees are. Now, the Sadducees, unlike the Pharisees, only bother with the law of Moses. They don't really get into all the stuff that the scribes were teaching, all their interpretations. They just pretty much want the law of Moses itself. So overall, you can say the Sadducees kind of fancy themselves to be a religious group. They support the high priest as leader of Israel. They are pretty much just the law of Moses. That's what they follow in their own piety. Nonetheless, they do function kind of as a middle ground there between the Pharisees and the Herodians in that they are somewhat pro-Rome, right? So you have the Pharisees, they're kind of anti-Rome. You got the Herodians, they're in favor of Rome. The Sadducees are kind of in the middle. They like the Romans well enough, but they fancy themselves a little bit more religious, kind of more like the Pharisees. So you've got this spectrum of people here. As you start looking at the actual groups involved here with the Herodians and the Pharisees and the Sadducees, I know that's a lot of names. We'll get to know them better as we move gradually through the passage. But what I want you to see here at the beginning is that Jesus is not contending with a united front. These men would bicker and argue with each other just as much as they bicker and argue with Jesus. Okay, so these men would normally be, before Jesus showed up, these men were enemies of one another. And you see them kind of coming together here to come against Jesus, but it's not as though they're all the same thing. These are not, all Jews in the days of Jesus are not exactly the same. They all have their own beliefs, their own agendas. They're all doing their different things. So just imagine that as all these men are coming here to ask Jesus these questions. They are enemies themselves, but one thing they have in common is none of them actually like Jesus. So that is why they're coming together in this one portion of Scripture here. Now, all that just to give you a clear picture of the scene. You have the surroundings there and the players involved, and also the stakes involved. These things are happening on the temple grounds, in the presence of the crowds, with representatives from all these different Jewish groups. So that is what is happening here. I lay that out for you just so you have an idea of all the different components of this portion here in Matthew 22. Okay, let's get into some more content here for my second heading. I want to make some general comment about the topics raised and how they are raised in this portion. So the actual questions being asked and some of the details about those things. And the assertion I made at the beginning is that the questions presented to Jesus together show the fullness of the wisdom of Jesus. So here they are trying to trap Jesus and test Jesus, but the end result is the exact opposite. We get a very full picture of just how insightful Jesus is as he deals with these men in this portion. So consider first of all that the questions represent different categories of knowledge. The questions being asked to Jesus are of different categories here. So the first question is about taxes being paid to Caesar in particular. So the question about taxes may be considered a political question. This is a question about governments and paying taxes to them. Now, the Jewish hesitations about paying taxes to Caesar certainly had some religious motivations. We'll get into all of that when we get to that passage. But all that to say, the consequences are still very political, even militaristic. You stop paying taxes to the government's going to come knocking on your door asking where their money is. And if there's enough of you, they might just come armed and be threatening you with warfare if you stop paying your taxes. So that's the kind of thing here raised in this first question, a very political, governmental, even militaristic question about paying these taxes. Then we have the second question, which is about the resurrection. The day when God would allegedly raise all people from the dead, both the just and the unjust. This is a sample of theological knowledge, a question about doctrine, what you believe about God. Now, perhaps your daily life is not so much affected by the answer to this question about the resurrection, or maybe other doctrinal matters don't affect your daily life very much at all. But it will shape your view of life and your view of the world in which you live, and also your view of the God who governs the world. So these are still big matters here, these theological matters, shaping the way you think about things. And as a sample of that kind of knowledge, we have this question about the resurrection, asked by the Sadducees. And then finally, we have the question about the greatest commandment, where the lawyer comes and asks Jesus, what is the great commandment of the law? This is an ethical question. This is about morals. How do I live? What should I have on my mind day in and day out? And what should I do? So this is an ethical question. So now all of these questions are being presented to Jesus now, and he answers them. So when Jesus answers these questions, he is showing himself to be the master of several categories of knowledge, whether political or theological or ethical. Jesus can handle anything. Any kind of question you bring to him, Jesus has an answer for it. So he's not just an expert in one kind of knowledge. He can do it all. He can handle any kind of question. So you see that as we progress through this line of questioning that we have here. Now, we can look at the same topics from another perspective, so let's do this from another angle here and see the motivation of these men as they come asking their questions. We actually see some things about their motivations here as we come to their questions, and that also teaches us about the wisdom of Jesus as he answers them. So the first question from the disciples of the Pharisees and from the Herodians is said to be a trap. It actually says they're coming to entrap him in his words. So this is some kind of trap that they have laid up for Jesus here, depending on how he answers. Their intention is to expose Jesus to some kind of trouble. They're asking him this question not because they honestly don't know the answer or don't have the answer. They're just trying to get Jesus into trouble. And when Jesus answers their question without springing that trap, he shows the kind of wisdom we might call cleverness. Maybe you might call it prudence. He's the kind of guy that even when you're coming against him, trying to entrap him, trying to get him somehow, he can get out of the trap. He is smart enough to answer your question without bringing some kind of trouble upon himself. So Jesus, in the very least, is a very clever guy. He knows how to field these difficult questions without springing the traps that his enemies have in mind for him in asking these questions. Meanwhile, we have the second question asked by the Sadducees. Now, this question strikes me as being more like a form of mockery, more like a question that is asked with a kind of laughter behind it. I just get the impression that this kind of question about this guy having this wife, he dies, all of his brothers marry the same woman in succession, that whole scenario there, I get the impression that this was their favorite question to ask anyone who believed in the resurrection. They just like to ask this question because they like to smirk as the person they're asking squirms and doesn't really know how to answer. Because it is kind of a hard question. It's definitely an unusual question, but they've thought about this really well. They've got this question they like to ask these poor people who believe in the resurrection just to watch them squirm as they ask it. That's the impression I get as I read the Sadducees coming to Jesus with this question. Now, when Jesus answers their question, he shows that he can prove his own wisdom even in the face of mockery. So here come these guys with this question that they consider, they're great. This is their great moment to stump him, with this question that stumps everybody else. But Jesus keeps a cool head, gives his answer, and it's an answer that completely silences the Sadducees. So they leave there with the joke's on them, so to speak, when they leave. But Jesus himself, not disturbed by this kind of thing, he can handle mockery. He can keep a cool head even in the face of people coming with their tricky questions like that. And then finally, we have the lone lawyer coming up with the Pharisees, actually, but the lawyer is the one who asked the question. And his question is said specifically to be a test. So here's a guy, you have maybe you kids out there, you're doing your schooling, and every so often there's a test to see how much you know, because the teacher has to know how well you're learning. Well, here's a guy who thinks he can submit a test to Jesus and can actually grade Jesus to see how much he actually knows. Here's a guy who's going to take the role of a teacher over and against Jesus himself. And that's his mentality. He's coming there, with his grade book, going to keep track of how well Jesus answers the questions here. That's his mentality. Well, the result of that is Jesus here answers the question, and he gives an answer that's insightful enough that 2,000 years later we all remember it, and it has been viewed as a great guiding principle for how to live all this time. And that particular lawyer has been completely forgotten. We don't even know his name anymore. So here comes this guy thinking he's the superior of Jesus. He can test Jesus. He can grade Jesus. But Jesus turns out to be the greater of the two men. So even when being tested, Jesus doesn't just pass the test. He becomes the master. He becomes the teacher. So that's what happens when this kind of thing occurs, when Jesus is asked this kind of question. So whatever the motivation is in these men asking Jesus these questions, we see Jesus prove his own wisdom, whether by his cleverness or his cool-headedness or his great abundant insight that makes him greater than any other teacher there in Israel. No matter what the motivation is, Jesus shows himself to be greater and wiser than all of these people. Now we have one more angle we can use to view this. We can see the great wisdom of Christ from his enemies themselves. Just taking another look at these men coming to Jesus and just the situations in which they find themselves as they ask Jesus their questions. So the first one we might see as an example of enemies working together, because we have the disciples of the Pharisees and also the Herodians coming together asking this question. Now, these people are polar opposites. Pharisees are a religious group. Herodians are a political group. The Pharisees are anti-Rome. The Herodians are pro-Rome. They are very different groups. But, in a sense, that makes them a great team because they can draw from their different experiences, their different connections, their different ways of viewing things. They can come together and create a kind of perfect trap for Jesus that if he falls afoul on one of them, if he escapes the trap from one angle, he might fall into the trap on the other angle. So you have these two groups of men. They're kind of like the blades of a pair of scissors coming in there to come cut Jesus down. But, Jesus escapes that trap. So even though you have these two polar opposite types of people coming together here, forming in a sense a kind of dream team, even so, Jesus escapes their trap. Meanwhile, you have the Sadducees. Here they are, a united front within themselves. These men themselves very much agree with one another. They're strong, united, we stand. They have their question they like to ask everybody. It's a question that's worked well so far. It's a time-tested way to make somebody nervous. If he believes in the resurrection, just ask him this question, and it'll make him nervous. They've got all this experience and all this unity with themselves. They don't do any better. They can't make Jesus lose his cool. They can't make Jesus seem less intelligent than he's already proven himself to be. So that doesn't work either. And then you have this lawyer coming in. He is the scriptural expert. These lawyers, these were the experts in the law of Moses. They were the supposed experts in its interpretation and its application. They studied all the other scriptures as well. This is a man who was probably trained professionally by some rabbi and has been teaching for a while. He has an education that would have put Jesus to shame. Jesus was just a carpenter. We don't know of him ever having any professional training whatsoever, and he probably did not. But in spite of all this man's expertise, Jesus is able to outshine him as well. So looking again at each enemy and group of enemies that comes here, Jesus outdoes all of them. He shows his own insight over and against all of these men. So again, it's the same thing all from different angles, but the ultimate takeaway here from all of this is the fullness of the wisdom of Jesus. However you look at it, you see another way in which Jesus really is the wisest man standing in that circle as these debates are happening. We see that Jesus can comfortably maneuver in any field of knowledge, whether it's political or theological or ethical. We see that Jesus composes himself with such varied wisdom that he is invincible under cross-examination. Right? No matter who's doing the questioning and what the circumstances are, he can actually answer the questions and move on without much trouble. And we see that no cast of characters is actually large enough to outperform him. Even with all these other people around him, all these other dignitaries and well-known men, Jesus is still the one who steals the scene in this crowd. In all this way, we see the fullness of his wisdom come out as he deals with these questions from these different men. Now, that brings me to my third heading, which is very much connected to this. And the question we're asking here is, why is this important? Why is it important to see the fullness of the wisdom of Jesus? Why did God arrange things so that this would happen? Why did Matthew record these events? What is going on here? Well, I have said that Christ shows the fullness of his wisdom to support his recent accusations. All right, now I want to give you a summary of the prior portion that I finished a few months ago, teaching through Matthew, just to bring this all fresh to your mind. And I said that portion, I titled it as "The Leaders of the Kingdom Lose the Kingdom." That is because that's basically what you see in that portion. These different leaders there in Jerusalem have their status in the kingdom of God greatly diminished. Jesus taught this in the most direct way possible in a face-to-face confrontation with the leaders of Israel, starting when he showed up in the temple there on that day in Jerusalem. Jesus started by exposing their own faithlessness and cowardice in their response to John the Baptist. They came to him asking him by what authority he did the things he did. He turned the tables on them, showing that they didn't have the authority to ask that question because they were a bunch of faithless cowards, and his proof for that was how they responded to John the Baptist. Jesus then takes the initiative and starts telling parables. In his first parable, he compares the leaders to a child who agrees to work for his father and then does not go to work for his father. He says, "Yes, sir, I will go," and then does not go. So he shows them to be very shallow in their obedience to God by that parable, not at all committed. Then in the second parable, Jesus compares the leaders to vine growers of a vineyard who withhold the produce from the owner, kill the owner's servants, and then even kill the owner's son in the attempt to take over the vineyard. Really, really bad vineyard keepers, really, really bad people to have renting your property from you. But that is Jesus' analogy for the leaders of Israel in his own time. That is how he characterized them. And then finally, Jesus tells the parable of the wedding feast in which the whole city of Jerusalem is implicated for refusing the gospel. So the leading city of Israel at that time very much being shown to lose the kingdom in its own way. Now, the result of all of this is a loss of the kingdom of God, and Jesus tells them as much in one of those parables, that the kingdom of God will be taken away from them and given to a nation bearing the fruit of it. These are very weighty words. These are strong accusations to be making there in Jerusalem itself, talking to the leaders of that city. Now, people of humility, willing to examine themselves, would have withdrawn in private to consider what Jesus told them. They would have gone away and said, okay, have a man of God here coming to tell me all these things that I'm doing wrong, all these things that are wrong with me, and the judgment that's going to come upon me from God for all of this. Maybe I should think about this. Maybe I should consider whether the accusations are true. Maybe I should examine myself. Instead, the Jerusalem authorities respond to Jesus with an old trick. Okay? An old trick that is probably as old as time. You may have noticed this in your dealings with other people. If you've never seen this, you probably will at some point. If you ever confront somebody with some sin in his life, that person will often change the topic from his sin to some controversial issue. I don't know if you've experienced this, but it happens very often. I've seen it many times. It seems to be very natural. They basically just want to take the pressure off themselves because you've put the pressure on them. You've said, look, I've seen this in your life. This is not right. This is not good. You need to repent of this. And they don't like that. So it's like, well, what do you think about this? Or how about this? They just change the topic to something controversial, maybe slightly related to what you told them, but not entirely what you came to discuss with them. They just change the topic. It's an old dirty trick that people use to take the pressure off of them. Here you are trying to confront them on their sins, but they're going to change the topic. And these men do the same thing. They do exactly that. These are not people of humility, nor are they willing to examine themselves. For that reason, they resort to the old trick and try to get Jesus talking about something else, anything else, besides their sins. And that is the whole reason that these men come up with these questions and start posing these questions to Jesus. They're trying to distract Jesus and also those crowds who are there from thinking about the wickedness that Jesus has just exposed. They're trying to change the topic. The beauty of all of this is the old trick backfires on them and only makes the accusations of Jesus more powerful. This whole conversation with all of these questions only serves to reinforce how correct Jesus is in what he's saying. You know, if some fool comes to you with an accusation, you can easily ignore him. If someone comes to you telling you about something wrong in your life, but you know this guy is he's not very bright, he's not very well learned, he doesn't really understand the ways of God, that's easy to ignore. But if the wisest man you know comes to you with an accusation or a rebuke or something wrong about you, that's really hard to ignore if he's the wisest person you know. Well, in this portion of Matthew, Jesus shows himself to be the wisest man there, the wisest man in the whole city. As all these different leaders of Jerusalem and Israel come to him with their hard questions, and Jesus silences all of them and astonishes all of them. Jesus shows himself to be the wisest person there, which means his accusations cannot be ignored. All that stuff he was saying before, yeah, that probably still applies. If he's a wise man now answering these questions, he was probably a wise man 5 minutes ago telling all those parables, accusing these leaders of their sins. So here they are trying to distract the crowds and distract Jesus from their sins, but it has the exact opposite effect. Jesus just shows that he's the kind of man that you should listen to him. He is the exact kind of man who has the authority to make the kind of accusations, because he is wiser than anyone else there, especially wiser than the men he is accusing at that time. So Christ shows the fullness of his wisdom to support his recent accusations. All right, so now we come to my fourth heading in all of this. I want to give you my overall impression of how Jesus answers these questions from these leaders. This is somewhat nebulous, but it's a thought that came to my mind that I thought was precise enough. It deserved a place here in the sermon, but I can only describe it by saying this. The answers of Jesus enlarge the mind. I couldn't think of any other way to say what I meant other than to say this. The way Jesus answers these questions has the effect of enlarging your mind. And I think you'll know what I mean by that as I get talking about it. So let's just begin. The most basic observation I can make is that in none of these questions did Jesus give any of the answers which might have been expected. I think maybe if you're asking someone a question, you might be having in your mind the kinds of answers that a person might give. And then now imagine the person gives you an answer that you didn't even see coming. Right? You didn't even think that was an option. That's the overall effect of how Jesus answers these men. All right? So when you ask about the lawfulness of paying taxes to Caesar, the expected answers were simply yes or no. I mean, you either pay taxes or you don't. It's kind of the way it is there. Any further comments would simply be arguments in favor of the yes or the no. Right? That'd be the way you would expect that question to be answered. Well, then you have the second question they ask about marriage and the resurrection. That should have been answered by indicating which of those 7 men would have that woman as his wife in the resurrection. Pick one. The first man, the last man, pick one. Which one gets the woman in the resurrection of the dead? That'd be the way you would expect that question to be answered. And then you have the question about the great commandment of the law that the lawyer asked to Jesus, and you would expect to get one answer to that, right? One great commandment to serve as the great commandment. Those are the ways you would expect these questions to be answered. Well, while all those kinds of answers might have been expected, Jesus gives very different kinds of answers to these questions. Now, in future sermons, I will explain all of this in greater detail. I'm going to paint with a very large brush right now and not give you much detail. But just to give you a very cursory overview of how he answers their questions, I can say this. He does not answer according to expectations at any point in these conversations. When asked about the lawfulness of paying taxes to Caesar, the response of Jesus was not simply yes or no. That would have been the expected answer. Instead, Jesus implies that the whole way of thinking about Caesar in relation to God and how taxes fall into that, the whole way of thinking about that needs to be different. It needs to be a different kind of thing. So he doesn't just come in there with a yes or a no. He comes in there with a game-changing answer, right? And then secondly, when Jesus answers the question about marriage and the resurrection, he does not specify which man is going to have the woman as wife. In fact, he says, you've got the complete wrong way of thinking about this. You're mistaken, not knowing the scriptures or the power of God. Instead, Jesus makes the whole question obsolete by arguing for the absence of marriage in the resurrection. He just takes the whole question and throws it out. And then he makes an argument for the resurrection itself, which is admittedly very indirect and therefore equally unexpected, arguing from the law of Moses in a passage that does not seem to be about the resurrection at all, but which nonetheless has implications that show the resurrection of the dead to be a real, true doctrine. None of that was expected when they asked that question. And then as for the greatest commandment, Jesus does not give one answer, one commandment. That's what the lawyer was asking. Which commandment is the great commandment of the law? Jesus actually gives them 2 answers. He gives them the great commandment and then the second greatest commandment. And I think he has a reason for doing that, but the point is, he didn't just stop where the lawyer was asking him to give an answer. He went and did more than that for some reason. And we'll talk about that when we get there. Now, all that to say, as we consider the answers which were expected and the answers which Jesus gave, there's not a correlation between the two. Jesus does not give the expected answers to these questions. Instead, his answers have the effect of what I've called enlarging the mind, broadening your mind, so to speak. Now, what I mean by that is this. Very often, and without knowing what we are doing, We very often limit ourselves in the way we approach controversies or difficult questions. We don't realize we're doing it, but we have a way of limiting ourselves as we think about difficult matters. We get so accustomed to saying yes or no, either or. There are only two options here, it's this one or this one. We get so used to thinking in those ways. And we begin to think that the only possible answers to a question are the answers listed for us. These are the things that other men have said. I now need to pick from this list of options here what I'm going to believe about this controversial matter. We very often forget to look for answers maybe that no one has suggested, maybe answers that exist in the places we haven't looked. We forget to think beyond the given possible answers and look for something else. Sometimes what we need, actually, is more imagination. We need to think a little more creatively. We know this well enough that we have sayings about it. There are things we actually say. We talk about people who think outside the box. Like, well, what box? Well, it's just a saying. Just thinking outside the box means not saying what everyone else has said, doing what everyone else has done. Do something different. We talk about escaping the horns of a dilemma. We talk about blazing a trail. We have all these sayings that describe this kind of thing. Apple used to have as their slogan, think different. You have all these posters saying, think different, with some great intellectual person from the past on the poster. One way or another, we see the value of this kind of approach, of someone that comes to a difficult question or a difficult topic and does not think about it the way someone else does, the way everyone else has thought about it, who brings a totally fresh approach to it. The problem is, so few of us can do that. So few of us have the imagination to actually do that. We get stuck on the options. We get stuck on option 1, 2, and 3, and we forget to ask if there's an option 4. That's just how it works. Just so few people have the ability to do that. But we need people who have that kind of imagination, who can enlarge our minds, who can get us thinking outside the box and get moving again. So where people have been arguing about this thing and disagreeing about this thing for a long time, we need someone to come in and give a different answer and break up what's been going on and take it all in a new direction. We need someone like that. Otherwise, we'll be stuck in the same old debates, saying the same old things over and over again until the end of time. We need someone who can do that, who can come in there and give us a fresh answer. Now, you might consider it faint praise to say that Jesus had a good imagination for answering questions, right? Normally, that's not the kind of thing, when we sing songs about Jesus, we don't sing about his great imagination for answering questions. But to anyone who witnessed those debates happening there in Jerusalem, and we know this because Matthew says it happens, they were astonished. They were silenced. The way they responded to this was a big deal. Coming in here with all these different answers that no one ever heard before, this made jaws drop to the floor, when Jesus was answering these questions. It was a big thing. To anyone that had an open mind and a heart to hear what Jesus was saying, they would have been greatly helped by his answers to these questions. Their minds would have been enlarged, right? Jesus was that kind of person. He can come in there to all these tired old debates and answer in a way that just makes your mind feel like it got 2 sizes too bigger, because he answered in a way that no one else thought to answer. That is the overall effect as I read this portion. The answers of Jesus have a way of broadening the mind. Beyond the standard answers, he comes in there with different answers that totally changes the nature of these debates. You will see more of what I mean by that as we get into all of the actual passages that are coming later. I just tell you that now so that you can be expecting that whenever I refer back to the idea of these things being a kind of an outside-the-box sort of answer to these questions here. Okay, in my final heading for today, I want to end where Christ ended, because Jesus ends this conversation in a very specific place. He decides when the conversation is over, and he ends it in a very specific place. Christ ends this debate by bringing it back to the beginning, by starting all over again with what he really wanted to say, in a sense. Jesus ends this debate with the divine kingship of the Messiah, with the idea that the Messiah is more than just a man, more than just a king. He is a divine king. Now, section 6 of Matthew's Gospel began with a portion that I titled, "The Divine King Openly Observed." Okay, that's how I said section 6 begins. The divine king openly observed. The events of that portion were the healing of the 2 blind men at Jericho, then the spectacular entrance of Jesus into Jerusalem, and then Jesus' attack on the way people were worshiping in the temple, the literal attack as he was turning over tables there. All of that happening, all in one big line of events there. And I argued that those events were all a revelation of Jesus' identity as the divine king. He shows himself basically as the person who owns Jerusalem, owns the temple, comes in there with not just royal authority, but divine authority to do those things. Prompting the question, by what authority do you do these things? When the leaders come in there and ask him that question. Now, when we move into that second portion of section 6, we did not quite leave behind the idea of the divine king. Now, Jesus himself was focused on how the leaders of the kingdom would lose the kingdom. That's how he starts dealing with these leaders of Jerusalem there. But the whole portion flows out of that challenge by the leaders. By what authority are you doing these things? And the answer ultimately is his authority as the divine king, as the divine Messiah coming in to claim what is his right, to establish his kingdom his way. And as Jesus confronts those men, he does so with the authority of a divine king. He makes it clear that he outranks them. He speaks not only as king, but as Lord over them. So that's how that second portion goes. Now, as we move into these debates, as we move into the third portion, and we come to these controversies, these questions, perhaps you might think that we have left behind the idea of Jesus as the divine king, because they're asking questions about taxes, they're asking questions about the resurrection, they're asking about the Great Commandment. It seems like maybe we've left behind the whole idea of divine kingship. But remember, they're trying to distract Jesus from what he's been talking about and from what he's been doing. So they, at least in their minds, they're trying to move away from all of that. And we might be so distracted that we might fall for it. We might get so caught up in how Jesus answered this question about taxes, how he answered this question, how he answered that question. We might get so distracted that we might forget everything Jesus was doing as well. We might forget this revelation of the divine king and how he comes in there and humbles these leaders and shows them that they're losing their kingdom. We might forget that well. We might forget that as well. Which is why I've given this portion a title that will not let you forget the idea of his kingship. The insightful king silences the fools. I have worded it that way for a reason. I want you to remember that Jesus is a king and he's acting as a king as he does these things. And I think that's fair because Jesus wants you to remember that as well. Let's look again at how he ends things. Let's read the final passage in this controversy here. Matthew 22, starting in verse 41. After he's answered all their questions, says, "Now, while the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them a question. 'What do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he?' They said to him, 'The son of David.' He said to them, 'Then how does David in the Spirit call him Lord, saying, "The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies beneath your feet?' If David then calls him Lord, how is he his son?" It says, "No one was able to answer him a word, nor did anyone dare from that day on to ask him another question." So after dabbling with tired old controversies, Jesus returns these men to the chief question of their generation, the question that really, really mattered more than any of their questions. This question is also the question which the leaders are trying to avoid at that very moment. They're trying to create a distraction so they don't have to answer this question. And that question is, who or what is the Messiah? It is a question about the Messiah himself. Now, the way Jesus argues from this Psalm of David, he confronts them with a view of the Messiah far beyond what many of those men wanted. He presents them with a view of the Christ that is not quite what they expected. Yet again, not what they expected. Several of those men probably wanted no Messiah at all. The Sadducees and the Herodians were definitely of that mind. They were not waiting for a Messiah. They didn't want a Messiah. They were happy with the way things were, generally speaking. Those who did want a Messiah simply wanted a king to fight their battles for them, kind of like in the Old Testament. Rally the troops, beat the Romans, make us an independent nation again. That's what they want their Messiah to do. The Pharisees were basically that way, and probably that lawyer as well that we see show up. But the way Jesus teaches about the Messiah, he's more than a king and even more than David, greater than the greatest king in Israel's history. If David calls him Lord, then who or what must this Messiah be? If that is the way David talks about this Messiah, then what can he be? Now, I'll handle all of that in more detail when we get to that passage. I know I keep saying that, but there's a lot of detail here, and I just want to prompt your mind and get it into the right place as we go into this portion. For now, I just want you to realize that Jesus ends the debate where it began. He ends it by refocusing their minds on the question they should have been asking at that time. The debate started when a man entered Jerusalem as something more than a man and even more than a king. That's how all of this started. Everything was fine in Jerusalem. They woke up that morning there before Jesus showed up, and it's like, another day in Jerusalem, and then their whole world gets turned upside down because here's this guy, Jesus, doing all this stuff that no man has ever had the authority to do the things that he's doing. No man has ever done this. And it's turning their whole world upside down. They should have been grappling with that. And they should have been grappling with their ideas about the Messiah and how they should have thought about him. And Jesus returns them with his question to that place of thinking. He returns them to the very question that they should have been asking. Is the Messiah merely a king to fight your battles for you? Or is he God in the flesh come to rule what is rightly his and even unseat those people who aren't on board with what he's doing? What is your view of the Messiah? Who is he? Who is the Christ? And what do you think about him? That's the question they should have been asking, and Jesus ends this portion by returning them to that question. He ends it with the divine kingship of the Messiah. Okay, so as I said at the beginning, the sermon for today was meant not only to introduce to you this third portion of Matthew section 6, but to show you why I summarize it and title it the way I do, just to give you a brief introduction to it and to explain myself when I give you my title for this, which is The Insightful King Silences the Fools. Now, to help you see that, I gave you an outline of 5 headings. Let's go over them again, just a summary here at the very end. First of all, these events happen on the temple grounds in the presence of the crowds with representatives from several groups in Jerusalem. This is a citywide matter. It's public. Anyone who's anyone is there. They're in the temple listening to Jesus answer these questions. Secondly, the questions presented to Jesus together show the fullness of his wisdom. Okay, so no matter how you look at it, how you look at the questions, how you look at the men asking those questions, some way or another, the wisdom of Christ is on full display as he answers these questions. Thirdly, Christ shows the fullness of his wisdom to support his recent accusations. Here they are trying to avoid the implications of the rebuke he was giving them in the prior portion, but the way he answers these questions and the wisdom that he shows himself as having, it just reinforces his right to make those kinds of accusations against these men. Fourthly, the answers of Jesus enlarge the mind. He gives answers to these questions that you would not expect, but in so doing, it actually allows you to become wiser as you think about these things, as you think in new ways that you never thought possible. That is the effect of how Jesus answers these questions. And then finally, Jesus himself brings all these debates to an end with a question of his own, and the purpose of that question is to bring everything back to the beginning, asking about the Messiah and showing his divine kingship. And therefore, I've titled this portion, The Insightful King Silences the Fools. So get used to hearing that phrase for the next several months, because that is the summary of this portion of Matthew. I also promised at the beginning of this sermon that you would see these Jerusalem authorities as bad examples, and I expressed my hope that you would see them that way and learn to do the opposite of everything they do. As I think about these men, I see several habits of unbelief which are threats to us all, against which we must be on guard. They display several ways of acting that's very common for people who are faithless or disobedient to God, and I think we need to mark these ways of acting and be on guard against them in our own lives. This mostly applies to times when someone else has rebuked us or opposed us. Someone has come into our nice, peaceful existence and upset everything by telling us that we're wrong in some way, by challenging us in some practice of ours or some activity of ours. rather than trying to entrap the person or mock that person or test that person or in any way drag him down to your level, we should instead ask the Lord to give us eyes to see what that person has seen and to ask for repentance. That is the proper way to respond to that kind of situation. Now, I'm sure there are times when someone comes to you and maybe his accusation is not right. I'm sure that does happen. But for the most part, I think among Christians, if somebody actually comes to you saying, brother, sister, I see this in your life, it doesn't look good, if that actually happens, there probably really is something to it. And your job is not to change the topic. Your job is not to try to defame that person in front of the crowds or the other people of your church. Your job is to sit there and consider that in humility and see if you actually do need to repent. So, with that in mind, as we study this portion, take note of all the things that these leaders here are doing and try very hard to do the opposite because they're going the wrong way with this when Jesus comes in there and rebukes them. Let's be sure that we walk in a different fashion, in a way that's characterized by humility and a willingness to be corrected. Let's remember that as the great lesson we can learn from these bad examples. Okay, well, that is the end of what I have to say today. I know there are probably a lot of questions that have been raised that I keep saying we'll answer that later, but I'm willing to field questions now if you think the question should be asked now. Are there questions on any of this or comments that people have on this part of our study?